I want to begin this briefing with a single sentence, not a headline, not a talking point, a sentence that captures precisely what we are dealing with: a nuclear-capable, US-backed military with one of the most sophisticated air defense networks on the planet has determined that it cannot protect its own third-largest city from incoming missiles. Let that settle for a moment. This is not a narrative being pushed by hostile media. This is not the assessment of adversarial governments. This is the operational conclusion of the Israeli Defense Forces themselves, written into civil defense orders, communicated through official home front command channels, and executed on the ground as 50,000 residents of northern Haifa were told to leave their homes. My name is Dr. Marandi, and in the next 25 minutes I am going to give you the analysis that explains not just what is happening, but why it is happening, what it means going forward, and what history tells us about where this trajectory leads. I am going to give you context on the missile systems that forced this decision, the geography that shaped it, the strategic logic that preceded it, and the three futures now competing to determine the outcome of this conflict. If you have been watching mainstream coverage and walking away with more confusion than clarity, that is not an accident. The complexity of what is unfolding in northern Israel is being systematically simplified into digestible segments that strip out the strategic architecture. My job today is to put that architecture back. Stay with me for the full briefing. This will be worth your time. Let us start with the geography, because in warfare, geography is not background, it is argument. Haifa sits on the Israeli Mediterranean coast at approximately 32.8 degrees north latitude. The Lebanese border lies roughly 35 kilometers to the north in practical military terms, that is about 22 miles. On a map it looks like a short drive. In missile physics, it is a terrifyingly brief window, a subsonic cruise. Missile covers that distance in approximately 12 minutes. A ballistic missile in its terminal descent phase covers it in under 4 minutes. You do not scramble intercept systems in 4 minutes. You either have them up and tracking already, or you do not. Now add the topography. Haifa is built on the northern slope of Mount Carmel, which rises roughly 546 meters above the Mediterranean. The city faces north and northeast directly toward Lebanon, forming what military planners sometimes describe as a natural targeting bowl. The terrain that makes Haifa visually dramatic is the same terrain that makes it aerodynamically exposed. But here is what transforms Haifa from an important city into a strategic node whose disruption would cascade through the entire Israeli economy and military structure. The port of Haifa processes approximately 26 million tons of cargo per year. It is Israel's primary deep-water commercial port and the entry point for a substantial share of Israel's fuel imports, raw materials, and military logistics. Disrupt this port, not destroy it. Simply disrupt it through credible threat and you begin strangling Israel's supply chain from the north. The Bazan oil refinery complex in the Haifa Bay area processes approximately 60% of Israel's domestic petroleum consumption. These are not abstract industrial facilities. These are the facilities that keep Israeli tanks fueled, Israeli aircraft flying, and Israeli generators running through a sustained conflict, a precision strike. On the refinery complex does not just cause an explosion, it causes a strategic cascading failure. The Madam Technology Park, located in the southern Haifa suburbs, employs over 14,000 workers in defense electronics, cybersecurity systems, and advanced manufacturing. Companies operating there include major defense contractors whose output directly feeds Israeli military capability. You damage Madam, you damage the supply chain of the Israeli military itself. This is why the Israeli Home Front Command's decision to evacuate northern Haifa districts, including portions of Kiryat Haim, Kiryat Bialik, and the industrial zones abutting the port, is not a precautionary footnote. It is a strategic admission. The official statement released by the Home Front Command described these evacuations as a response to credible intelligence regarding advanced missile threats that exceed current interception capabilities in the northern sector. Read that phrase again. Exceed current interception capabilities. Not strain, not challenge, exceed. That is a military command telling its own citizens, we cannot guarantee your safety here, leave. Now let us talk about the specific missile systems driving this calculation, because this is where the mainstream coverage consistently fails the viewer. The story being told is usually one of numbers: how many rockets, how many interceptions, how many casualties. The story that matters is one of capability thresholds, and the threshold that has now been crossed changes the entire conflict calculus. The Fatih 110 family precision at Mach 3.5. The Iranian-developed Fatih 110 is a solid-fuel, single-stage ballistic missile that has been progressively upgraded and transferred to Hezbollah in various configurations over the past decade. I want to walk you through what makes this weapon qualitatively different from the rocket arsenal Hezbollah was fielding in 2006. The baseline Fatih 110 has a range of approximately 300 kilometers. The upgraded Fatih 313 variant, which intelligence assessments indicate Hezbollah possesses in significant numbers, extends that range to 500 kilometers. But range is not the critical variable here. The critical variable is the circular Error probable, or CEP, a measure of how close to a designated target a weapon system lands 50% of the time. The FATA 313E's CEP is estimated at under 10 meters. 10 meters, that is not hitting a neighborhood, that is not hitting a city block, that is hitting a specific building. In some configurations, it means hitting a specific section of a building. Hezbollah is estimated to possess between 400 and 700 Fateh series missiles. During the entire 2006 Lebanon war, 34 days of intensive conflict, Hezbollah fired approximately 4,000 rockets into northern Israel. The vast majority were unguided. They terrorized populations and imposed costs, but they could not reliably destroy a designated hard target. The FAT E313 can. That is not a quantitative upgrade. That is a weapons category change. Now combine that precision with the terminal velocity. The FAT E110 in its final descent phase reaches approximately Mach 3.5, roughly 4,200 km per hour. The Iron Dome system, which has become synonymous internationally with Israeli missile defense, was engineered and optimized primarily against short range rockets and artillery shells traveling at far lower velocities. Against those threats, Iron Dome achieves interception rates consistently above 85%, sometimes higher. Against a ballistic missile traveling at Mach 3.5 with evasive maneuvering capability in the terminal phase, Israeli defense officials, in closed briefings whose contents have been reported by Israeli outlets including Haaretz, have acknowledged interception success rates against Fateh-class missiles of between 50 and 65%, and that figure represents optimal conditions. Let me give you the operational arithmetic that flows from those numbers. Hezbollah fires a salvo of 10 Fateh missiles at a single designated target, say, a refinery pumping station or a port logistics hub. Israeli Iron Dome and David's Sling intercept 6 or 7 of them. 3 reach the target, 3 precision warheads hitting a petrochemical facility do not produce minor damage. They produce fires that burn for days, structural failures that take months to repair, and contamination events that close surrounding areas for extended periods. And here is the economic dimension that defense planners are working with simultaneously. Each Iron Dome interceptor costs Israel approximately $50,000. Each Fateh 110 costs Hezbollah somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000 according. 2 estimates from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. In a small-scale exchange, Israel's cost advantage is manageable. In a sustained, high-tempo missile campaign targeting dozens of infrastructure nodes over weeks or months, Israel is spending $50,000 per intercept against an adversary that has already purchased its missiles and stored them underground. The economic attrition runs in Hezbollah's favor over time. The underground launch network guerrilla logic applied to ballistic missiles, the second development that forced the Haifa evacuation, is as important as the missiles themselves, and it has received far less coverage in Western media. Hezbollah did not simply accumulate a large missile stockpile. Over approximately 10 years of deliberate construction, the organization built an extensive network of hardened underground launch facilities throughout southern Lebanon, concentrated particularly in the areas north of the Litani River. Satellite imagery analysis by firms including Imagizat International, with findings reported in defense publications such as Jane's Defense Weekly, has identified a minimum of 120 confirmed underground launch sites, with potentially 200 or more additional suspected sites that Israeli intelligence has not yet been able to locate or assess with confidence. These facilities are not improvised bunkers. They are reinforced concrete structures buried under 15 to 20 meters of earth and rock specifically engineered to withstand direct strikes from precision-guided munitions. The missiles are stored horizontally in climate-controlled chambers. Hydraulic launch rails run through underground corridors to the surface. A crew can receive an order, move a missile to a launch position, fire and retreat back below ground within minutes. After launch, the crew is protected. The above-ground launch point offers almost no residual heat signature. There is no exposed infrastructure to target retroactively. What this represents is the application of classic guerrilla warfare doctrine: dispersion, concealment, resilience to a weapons platform that was previously associated exclusively with state-level military infrastructure. Traditional ballistic missile programs require large, fixed, identifiable facilities. They are vulnerable to air power precisely because of their visibility. Hezbollah has engineered away that vulnerability. The operational implication for Israel is severe. Destroying a single underground launch site requires extensive pre-strike intelligence gathering, multiple aircraft sorties, and precision munitions costing between $500,000 and $2 million per unit depending on the specific weapon. System deployed. Even a perfectly successful strike eliminates one site. Hezbollah has over 100. The mathematics of attrition work against the attacker in this environment. Israel has conducted hundreds of strikes against Hezbollah launch infrastructure over recent weeks. Hezbollah retains the overwhelming majority of its capability. This is the strategic problem that the Haifa evacuation reflects. There is no near-term military solution to an underground dispersed missile network of this scale and depth. Israel cannot bomb its way to safety for northern Haifa, not on any timeline that prevents significant infrastructure damage from occurring first. I want to address the third and perhaps most consequential development directly, because it involves a conceptual shift that rewrites the entire logic of the Northern Front. For 17 years following the 2006 Lebanon War, Israeli military doctrine in the north rested on a single pillar: deterrence through threat of retaliation. The calculus was explicit and for a long time functional. If Hezbollah launches a major missile campaign, Israel will respond with such devastating force against Lebanese infrastructure and Hezbollah's political base in southern Beirut that the cost to Lebanon, to the country, to Hezbollah's constituency, to Hezbollah's own organizational standing will exceed any conceivable military gain. Therefore, Hezbollah will self-deter in all but the most extreme scenarios. That framework has fractured, and it fractured along three distinct fault lines. First, the precondition for restraint has disappeared. Deterrence requires that the deterred party believes restraint will actually prevent the threatened outcome. Hezbollah's leadership has watched Israeli-targeted strikes eliminating senior commanders, Israeli ground operations expanding in southern Lebanon, and Israeli political leaders making explicit public statements about pushing Hezbollah back beyond the Litani River as a stated strategic objective. The operational conclusion drawn in Hezbollah's command structure is straightforward: Israeli pressure will intensify regardless of Hezbollah's behavior. There is no level of restraint that stops this trajectory. Therefore, the cost of restraint, continued degradation without the ability to impose equivalent costs on Israel, now exceeds the risk of escalation. Second, the retaliation threat has lost its credibility when Israel launched large-scale retaliatory strikes against Lebanese civilian infrastructure during the 2006 war. The political cost was significant but ultimately manageable. International criticism was intense but temporary. Western governments expressed displeasure, but maintained their relationships. With Israel, the diplomatic environment today is different in ways that constrain Israeli options. Multiple European governments, including France, Germany, and Italy, according to reporting by Reuters citing European diplomatic sources, have privately communicated to the Israeli government that large-scale destruction of Lebanese civilian infrastructure would trigger suspension of military cooperation agreements and potential restrictions on arms exports. These are not empty signals. European parliaments are politically sensitive to images of civilian devastation in Lebanon in ways that limit governments' ability to maintain business-as-usual relationships with Israel during and after high-casualty campaigns. The retaliation threat that once anchored deterrence now comes with a diplomatic price tag that reduces Israel's willingness to execute it fully. Third, Hezbollah's targeting doctrine has shifted. In previous conflicts, Hezbollah's primary targeting priorities were Israeli border communities and military installations. The political logic was to impose psychological costs and military friction while limiting strikes to areas where escalation could be managed. Hezbollah's public communications over the past weeks have stated explicitly that in a sustained conflict, the organization will target Israel's economic and industrial infrastructure, not border towns, not forward military positions, refineries, ports, power generation facilities, the exact categories of infrastructure concentrated in Haifa. This is not a threat designed for the previous deterrence framework. It is a strategic doctrine designed to exploit the precise vulnerability that makes Haifa indefensible without damaging it further: the concentration of irreplaceable economic infrastructure in a coastal city 35 kilometers from the Lebanese border. When the Israeli government ordered the evacuation of 50,000 residents from northern Haifa, they were responding to all three of these collapsed deterrence pillars simultaneously. They have concluded that Hezbollah is willing to fire precision missiles, that the interception architecture cannot reliably stop them all, and that the political, economic, and human cost of even a limited number of successful strikes on critical infrastructure is too high to accept. History does not repeat, but it rhymes with a clarity that should embarrass anyone who claims to understand strategy while ignoring the past. In 431 BCE, Athens and Sparta entered what became known as the Peloponnesian War. Athens was the preeminent naval power of the Greek world, wealthy, technologically sophisticated, externally supported. Sparta was the dominant land power, less refined, less financially sophisticated, but deeply entrenched in terrain that negated Athenian advantages. Both sides entered the conflict believing that their respective strengths would produce decisive victory. Both sides were wrong. What unfolded was a grinding, decades-long war of attrition that neither side could win definitively. Athens could not bring decisive force against Sparta on land. Sparta could not break Athens by sea. Both powers poured their resources into a conflict that produced tactical gains without strategic resolution, and in doing so, they exhausted themselves. Watching from the periphery was Persia, a power that had, just decades earlier, been the existential enemy of every Greek city-state. During the Peloponnesian War, Persia did something elegant and devastatingly effective. It played both sides, Persian gold. Flowed first to Athens, then to Sparta, then back again, not to help either side win, but to ensure that neither side could stop fighting long enough to recover. When the war finally ended with Athens' defeat, Persia had achieved in the diplomatic corridors of the Aegean what it had failed to achieve through direct military confrontation, the permanent weakening of both primary Greek powers. Without firing an arrow in the decisive phase, Persia regained control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Now apply that structural template to the current theater. Israel is fighting simultaneously in Gaza and on the northern front against Hezbollah. Both adversaries are supported financially, militarily, politically by Iran. The United States provides military hardware and diplomatic cover to Israel but has communicated clearly through its most senior defense officials that American ground forces will not enter this conflict. Regional Arab states are maintaining carefully calculated neutrality, absorbing information from both sides and making long-term positioning decisions. Iran is playing Persia's role. It is not fighting, it is enabling. It is supplying Hezbollah with the Fatih missiles that threaten Haifa. It is supplying Hamas with the doctrine that exhausts Israeli forces in Gaza. And it is watching Israel spend down its missile defense inventory, its military budget, its political capital, and its international diplomatic standing in a conflict that Iran designed to be unwinnable in the timeframe Israel requires. The parallel is structural, not superficial. The two-front overextension, the cost asymmetry that favors the proxies, the third-party power that benefits precisely because it is not in the fight, the exhaustion of the technically superior party through wars it cannot decisively end. Israel has faced versions of this strategic trap before. The question is whether its current leadership recognizes the template clearly enough to avoid the outcome Athens suffered, and whether recognition is even sufficient when the political pressures pushing toward escalation are as intense as they currently are. Let me give you clarity on the three trajectories now competing to determine the outcome of this conflict, because false certainty is a disservice and paralysis is worse. Path 1. Negotiated de-escalation. The diplomatic track, Israel and Hezbollah through intermediaries, most likely Qatar, France, and potentially Turkish-backed channels, agree to a ceasefire framework that freezes current positions, establishes an expanded buffer zone in southern Lebanon enforced by an augmented international monitoring presence, and creates a temporary halt to Israeli air operations and Hezbollah missile activity. This path requires both parties to accept outcomes they will publicly characterize as victories while privately knowing they are compromises. Israel accepts that Hezbollah retains its missile arsenal. Hezbollah accepts that its demonstration of strategic reach did not translate into a fundamental political shift. Domestically, both governments face pressure from constituencies that want more. That political dynamic makes negotiated de-escalation genuinely difficult to reach and extremely fragile if reached. My assessment of this path materializing within 90 days, under 30% probability. Path 2. Sustained low-intensity conflict. This is the most probable trajectory, and I want to be direct about why that makes it the worst humanitarian outcome. Neither side moves to full-scale war. Neither side achieves resolution. What emerges instead is a grinding, month-after-month cycle of limited Israeli strikes, periodic Hezbollah salvos, continued evacuations, and the slow economic degradation of both northern Israel and southern Lebanon. Northern Israel remains partially depopulated. The Haifa industrial corridor operates at reduced capacity under persistent threat. Southern Lebanon continues absorbing precision strikes. Both populations live in chronic instability without the psychological closure that either peace or decisive military resolution provides. And the underlying conditions, Hezbollah's missile arsenal, the hardened launch infrastructure, Israel's unresolved strategic objectives change very slowly, if at all. For Iran, this path is nearly ideal. Israel bleeds steadily, the costs compound, and Iran pays almost nothing. My assessment, approximately 55% probability over the next 90 days. Path 3. Full-scale escalation, one side, most likely Israel, responding to either a high-casualty infrastructure strike or a domestic political crisis that demands decisive action, launches a major ground operation into southern Lebanon. The objective, destroy Hezbollah's missile infrastructure through direct ground seizure and demolition rather than air power alone. Hezbollah responds with a full-scale missile barrage targeting not just Haifa but Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion International Airport, Israeli power grid infrastructure, and potentially chemical storage facilities in the Haifa Bay area. Iran makes a decision, the hardest and most consequential decision in this entire scenario, about whether the moment requires direct Iranian intervention or continued proxy management. The United States faces an equivalent decision about the scope of its support commitment. Internal IDF assessments, portions of which have been reported by Israeli media organizations, estimate that a full-scale war with Hezbollah could produce between 2,000 and 5,000 Israeli military and civilian casualties in the first month alone, with economic damage exceeding $30 billion from infrastructure destruction, mass displacement, and the functional paralysis of northern Israel's economy. My assessment, approximately 15% probability in the next 90 days, but that number does not stay at 15% indefinitely. It rises with every escalatory incident, every miscalculation, every commander who makes a decision under pressure that cannot be walked back. The evacuation of 50,000 people from Haifa is not a logistical footnote. It is not a precautionary measure that will be quietly reversed in 2 weeks when tensions ease. It is a public, documented acknowledgement by a militarily sophisticated government that the strategic map of northern Israel has been redrawn by weapons that did not exist in their current form and their current numbers when the last major Lebanon war ended in 2006. That acknowledgement has consequences. It signals vulnerability to Hezbollah. It signals political unsustainability to the Israeli public. It signals to Iran that the proxy investment is generating returns. And it signals to every government watching from the outside that the Eastern Mediterranean security architecture is under a stress. It was not designed to withstand. The questions I want you to carry forward from this briefing are these. If Israel's current air defense architecture cannot adequately protect Haifa, what does that imply for the other major population centers and industrial nodes within Hezbollah's missile range? If Hezbollah is strategically willing to absorb Israeli military and economic retaliation in exchange for demonstrating the capacity to hold Israel's economic core under permanent threat, what is the actual long-term objective, and is that objective achievable through a ceasefire framework? And how many evacuations, how many months of economic disruption, how many rounds of incomplete deterrence can the Israeli public absorb before domestic political pressure forces a binary choice between the two outcomes that carry the greatest risk: full escalation or a negotiated settlement that Israeli hardliners will describe as surrender? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the operational questions that will determine the next phase of this conflict. I am Dr. Marandi. We will continue tracking every significant development in northern Israel, southern Lebanon, and the broader regional architecture that is shaping this conflict in real time. If this analysis gave you clarity that you were not finding elsewhere, subscribe now, share it with the people in your network who are trying to understand what is actually happening beyond the headlines, and leave your assessment in the comments. I read them, and the pattern of what this community thinks matters. We will see you in the next briefing.